Let us see a work example on how you can draw an EER diagram from this description of a system. Like ER, the first step is to read the description of the system very carefully and finding out the entity, what can be the entities in this system, what will be the attributes of the entities, and what relationships are present in this system. So our first task is to find out these three things from this description. So this description says an organization depends on a number of different types of persons for its successful operation. The organization is interested in the following attributes for all of these persons. So person will be an entity and the person has these attributes: SSN, name, address, and telephone. A person may have multiple telephone numbers. That means these telephone numbers will be a multi-valued attribute. Three types of persons are of greatest interest. That means these persons can be further classified into three groups. These three groups are employees, volunteers, and donors. So what are the specialties of these three different groups? Employees only have a date hired attribute, so this is a new attribute which is an attribute of employee type of person. Volunteers have a skill attribute, so this is a special attribute for volunteers. And donors only have a relationship with an item that has number and name. That means donor type of persons will have a relationship with an item. So item will be an entity, and what item has? It has number and name. That means these two will be the attribute of item. Then it says a donor must have donated one or more items. That means a donor have to donate. There can be no donor who doesn't donate, and when a donor donates, it can donate one or more items. And an item may have no donors. That means in the item entity there may be item entity types or item entities who has no donors or one or many donors. So this line represents the constraints of the relationships. So, and it also says there are persons other than employees. So what does it mean? It says there are persons other than employees, volunteers, and donors. That means aside employees, volunteers, and donors, there are normal persons as well. So that a person need not belong to any of these three groups. On the other hand, at a given time, a person may belong to two or more of these groups. That means a person may be employees and volunteer at the same time, or employees and donors at the same time. In this way, it doesn't mean that an employee will belong to only one kind of these subgroups. So let us draw the EER diagram. So we have found out the entities. There are total 5 entities. So one is the first entity type is person. So person will be one kind of entity. Then employees, volunteers. Employees. Employee will be another kind of entity types. Then there will be volunteers. Then donors. Then items. So what will be the attributes of these entities? So we know the person has a session, then name, address, then telephone number. So this address telephone number is a multi-valued attribute. So what we can say, this will be double lines. Okay, so this double line represents that this telephone number is a multi-valued attribute of person. Okay, we should join them. So these are the attribute of person. And what other attributes are there? Item. Okay, before going to item, so it says there are 3 types of person, and these are employees, volunteers, and donors. Employee has a special attribute, that is date hired. So employee will have a attribute that is date hired. This is the attribute of employees. Then there will be some attribute of volunteer. Volunteer has a skill attribute, So volunteers attribute is skill, and donors will also have an attribute that is what is that? Donors don't have any attribute. It has a relationship with items, and items have attribute. So items have the following attributes. One is item number. One attribute is number, and another attribute is name. So these two are the attribute of items. Okay, and now it says that donors have a relationship with items. What relationships? The relationship name is donates. So donates is the relationship that exists between the item and donors. So we can draw a relationship so this relationship exists between donors and items, and the name of this relationship is donates, and this is connected between the donor and items, and it says a donor must have donated. That means the donors must participate in this relationship. They have to donate. And what does it say? It must have donated one or more items. That means it can donate multiple times. A donor can donate multiple times. So you can say here the cardinality will be many to many actually. So here the cardinality is m, and from the item side it says an item may have no donor. That means a item may not participate in this relationship, or it may have many donors, or an item may be donated by multiple persons, more than one person. So what we can say, the cardinality is many to many. Okay, so this is you have seen in the ER diagram, but now the extension comes here. It says the person are of three kinds: employees, volunteers and donors, and there are persons other than employee, volunteer and donors who are of the interest of the organization. That means okay, let me drag it a little bit. Okay, so this relationship comes from here, and now we can say the person are specialized into three categories. So we can say the person is specialized into employee, volunteers and donors, and will there be a single line or double line? Here will be a single line if not all the person have to necessarily or mandatorily belong to any of these three categories. If all the person of the organization, if they must belong in these three categories, then here we would draw double line. But it says there are persons other than employees, volunteers and donors. That means other than these three categories there are other person as well, so not all the person will participate in this specialization. This is the first condition. That means the participation of the persons are optional, not mandatory. And another condition is a person may belong to two or more of these groups. That means here the constraint is overlapping. That means a single person can be both employee and volunteers, or employee and donors, like this, or both employee, volunteers, donors, all. So a person may belong to more than one subcategories. So these constraints in the EER diagram, you can show different kinds of constraints. These constraints basically represents the participation of the parent entity type. Is the participation mandatory or optional? And the disjointness, is this disjoint or overlapping? If a single person or a single member in the superclass or super entity can belong to more than one subclass or sub entity at the same time, then the constraint is overlapping. And if a single member from this entity can belong to maximum one group or exactly one subgroup, then the constraints become disjoint. So in this way you can draw an EER diagram from a given description. Okay, I forgot to join these lines. These are the attributes of employee and this is the attribute of volunteer. So in this way you can draw an EER diagram. Beside, from this description, if you are asked to draw an EER diagram and you are given that in your EER diagram there should be a disjoint or overlapping constraint, or there should be a single participation, optional participation or mandatory participation. So these are the constraints you can draw in an EER diagram, and if you are given the constraints you can draw your own EER diagram.